Hello, thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the Huntley Area Public Library for hosting me today. With this bicycle presentation, I really hope that we're able to answer a lot of questions that you may have about getting your bike ready to safely and enjoyably ride this spring. And thank you again for joining us. Welcome. I'd like to talk to you today about waking up your bike for spring. My name's Robert. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be going over some basic maintenance and repairs that you might need to do on your bike as you pull it out of storage and get it ready for safe riding this spring. The repair kit that I'm going to mention in this presentation is available at all of the libraries along the Rock Island Trail. If your library is not along the Rock Island Trail, they may have something like this, they may not. All of the tools that I mention here are common tools. There are a few things that you might need specialty bicycle tools, and you can get them from pretty much any local bicycle repair shop or ordering them online. The stuff is real easy to find these days. Now, the first step is to take your bicycle down from the safe place where it has been stored all winter. Or dig it out of the garage or basement, wherever it got tossed last fall when you were putting it away. Hate to admit it, but this happens a lot. Now take a look at this bicycle. There's a lot of stuff that's wrong with this bicycle, but take a look at it from front to back and see if you can spot some of the things that need to be taken care of with this bicycle. This particular bicycle is one I wanted to use basically to demonstrate that you don't need to put a lot of money into a bicycle to get out and start enjoying bike riding. This is an older bike, and it was actually abandoned at my local library, sat outside for a couple years there, and then I brought it home to clean it up and do this presentation with it. And it got delayed, and I forgot about it, and it got left outside for another winter. So at least 2 hard winters, it was sitting outside rusting away. So it's got a lot of issues, but let's go over it point by point. There are no reflectors on this bike, and there's lots of dirt and lots of corrosion on this bicycle. Yes, lots of dirt and lots of corrosion. Also, the tires are very badly dry rotted. You can see as I press down on this tire, the cracks in the sidewall. There's every possibility that this tire could start coming apart if it's fully inflated. So these tires definitely need to be replaced. It's time to start taking things apart. And this is a coaster brake bike. I'm sure everybody either rode one of these as a kid or as an adult. It's basically you turn the cranks backwards to brake the bicycle, to slow it down or stop it. So the first thing we're going to start taking apart is the coaster brake arm assembly. The coaster brake arm is disconnected now. Now, when you're taking apart any bicycle, when you're working on pretty much anything with nuts and bolts, you want to use the right size wrench. And if you look at this axle nut, you can see that at some point in this bike's history, someone probably using an adjustable wrench rounded off this fastener. You want to be careful not to do this. It can cause bolts and nuts not to be tightened properly. If you have to use an adjustable wrench, you need to be very careful with it and keep your thumb on that thumb wheel of the adjustable wrench and make sure that the wrench actually fits tightly on the fastener. It's always best to use fixed wrenches or sockets that are the exact right size, because then you won't have that issue. Now, if you need to remove the chain, first step is find the master link. Now, there are many different styles and types of master links. Some have a little snap ring that you pry apart and the master link comes right apart. Sometimes you can't see any difference in any of the links on the chain, and that type of chain will come apart very much like this one. But this one, I can see that there is one link that is different, and I'm going to take it apart right there. I mentioned earlier a toolkit that's available at my local library, and this Master Link press is available in that toolkit from my local library here in Dunlap. And basically what this does is it drives the pin out of the chain link and allows me to take the chain apart. Here's a closer view of that Master Link press. Now, when you're working on a bicycle and you're taking things apart as far as I am here, you need to remember that on the left side of the bike, the pedals and the retaining nuts that hold the cranks together and hold the bearings in place are all left-handed. Now, what that means, if you've worked on any kind of machinery or mechanical things, you know that right is tight and left is loose. When the threads are left-handed, it's the opposite of that way. Left would be tightening it and right would be loosening it. And they do that on bicycle cranks and pedals on the left side of the bike so that as you're applying torque and riding the bike, so that those fasteners do not come loose. So if you are taking apart the pedals or cranks on a bicycle, be aware that on the left side, those pedals and cranks are going to be left-handed threads. Now, these are the crank bearings from this bicycle, and the grease that was on these has solidified and become sticky and gooey, and there's dirt in there. The bearings themselves are actually in pretty decent shape, so a bit of cleaning and some fresh grease, and these bearings are going to be just fine. Now I'm going to be removing the handlebars and the neck. First, you need to loosen this neck bolt here. It doesn't need to be loosened a great deal. I've got it loosened about 3/8 of an inch, and that's loose enough. And now the next step is to give it a tap with a hammer. And you can see here it's loose, and the neck has actually slipped down further into the fork tube. And here you can see the bolt that was holding it in place. This is called a stem expander bolt. And every neck that I have encountered so far has had something very, very similar to this. And basically, they're two wedge shapes. One wedge is machined into the neck, and one wedge is the actual nut on the end of this bolt. And as they're pulled together, they expand and grip the inner diameter of the fork tube. And that's what holds it in place. Now you can see it's possible you could remove the stem bolt all the way, and those two wedges will still be wedged together, and you still won't be able to get the neck out. So that's why you give it that little tap down and everything comes out straight away. These are the headset bearings. These are the bearings that allow your front fork to rotate. And just like the bearings on the crank, the grease had solidified and become sticky, gooey, and dirty. Now, your bike is probably not going to be in this state of disrepair. This bike was very neglected for a long time. So it needs a great deal of maintenance, cleaning, and repair to get it going again. But it's still simple stuff that you can do. This photo is of the front axle bearings from this bicycle. The wheel bearings on this bike were also, the grease had become very sticky, dirty, and they just needed to be cleaned, and with some fresh grease in there, they'll be good to go. But these were so sticky that the front wheel would barely turn. I'm also cleaning up the hub on these wheels. This is the section of the wheel where those bearings ride on, and all of the dirt and any corrosion needs to be polished out of there. So that needs to be cleaned up too before this wheel is reassembled. Now I'm removing those old dry rotted tires. It's very important not to use a screwdriver or anything metallic to remove a tire. It's very possible to scratch up the wheels on the bike or pinch the inner tube. These tools are ones that came in that kit that I checked out from my local library. You can also buy these type of tools for removing a tire from any bicycle shop, and they're very inexpensive. I just recently purchased a set from my local bike shop, and it was $3. Very inexpensive, and it will prevent you from damaging your new inner tubes or your wheels. Speaking of wheels, if you look at this photo, the wheel in the back I have cleaned up, and the wheel in the front has not been cleaned. You can see it makes a huge difference cleaning all of this surface rust off of the chrome. And the product I use to do this is very inexpensive. It's called Quadruple Zero Steel Wool, and it works great for polishing all types of metal, but it works especially great for getting surface rust off of chrome. If you do this, you want to make sure that it's 4 zeros, quadruple zero. If you use a SOS pad or some other type of steel wool, it will scratch the chrome and actually cause you more problems. It'll dull the chrome and make it rust faster, but quadruple zero steel wool is very fine, and it will polish up the chrome and make it look really nice. It's available at any hardware store or home center, and it's well worth having around. Now here's all of those bearings nice and cleaned up. I've got the bearing cups, the races, retainers, and the bearings all nice and cleaned and ready to be greased and reassembled. Now here I am reinstalling the bearing cups off of this bicycle. There's 4 bearing cups, 2 for the front fork, 2 for the cranks, and they're very, very simple to remove and install. Basically used a screwdriver from the opposite side to pop them out. And now that I'm putting them back in, it's not a very tight press fit, so you don't need to hit them very hard. And you also don't want to actually hit these bearing cups with a hammer. You can see I've got some chunks of old boards that I've got the frame sitting on, and I'm tapping them in with a board to protect these bearing cups so they don't dent, ding, or damage them. Now here I am reinstalling the headset bearings. I've got fresh grease on them, everything's cleaned up. The retaining nut at the top you see there, that just needs to be spun down, and it's not something that really needs to be tightened up. If you tighten down on it, you can actually damage the bearings. It just needs to be kind of finger tight, get the sloppy wobbliness out of the front forks, and then you'll lock that down with the retaining nut that goes on top of this. Here are the cranks. I've got them all cleaned up and polished, and those nice clean bearings on, and all greased up. Now this is just plain old red axle grease that I purchased a little can of from my local hardware store. You don't need anything really special. Plain old red axle grease from your hardware store will work just great. Now I'm reinstalling the cranks and bearings. This type of crank is called a one-piece crank because the cranks are one cast piece of metal. A lot of more modern bikes have what they call 3-piece cranks, where there's a centerpiece that the two cranks bolt onto. You need a special tool for removing those, and they're a little bit different than this, but same basic principle. If you're working on them, the bearings need to be properly lubricated and installed. Now I'm installing new tires on the wheels of this bicycle after they've been cleaned up. Now, I was actually able to reuse the original inner tubes that came with this bike. Despite the fact that they were very old and those tires were in such poor shape, the inner tubes held air just fine. I didn't need to buy new ones. And this is one of the reasons you want to be real careful when you're removing an inner tube, because you might be able to reuse it. And even if there is a pinhole in it, if you want to patch it, if you take it off with a screwdriver, you could tear it and completely destroy it. And you never, ever, ever want to use metal putting it back in, because almost every time you're going to pinch your inner tube and destroy it. So make sure you use these plastic tools. Like I said, $3 at a bike shop, it's well worth investing that little bit of money if you're going to be changing a tire. This is the front fork on this bicycle, and I thought this was a rather clever safety feature that this bicycle had. The washer that goes on the front axle has this little clip that fits into a hole on the front fork. That way, if the axle nuts come loose, the wheel won't just fall off. I'm sure many of us have heard horror stories about somebody's front wheel falling off and person going face first into the pavement, maybe losing some teeth. I point this out because if there are safety features on your bicycle and you're working on it, you want to make sure everything is reinstalled the proper way. You don't want to cause yourself any trouble down the road, so make sure everything goes back on the way it came off. Anytime in doubt, you can look up so many things on the internet to find out how any bicycle, any piece goes together in the correct manner. Now here's the bike all back together, but can anyone see what I might have forgotten? I forgot the chain guard. I point this out because it's very important to go over any project you're working on from front to back and make sure you didn't forget anything. You can see I've got new reflectors front and back, got those great big reflectors on the wheels. This bike is going to be highly visible. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to check every fastener on this bike. I had this bike so taken apart, could have overlooked something, so I want to go back and make sure every nut and bolt on this bicycle is tightened. Next, I'm going to check the tire pressure. The recommended tire pressure will be embossed on the side of the tire. Every tire has the pressure embossed on the side. You want to be careful. You don't have to fill it if the tire pressure says 50 pounds. It doesn't have to stay right at 50 pounds. You may want to go a little bit under that, but that is the maximum you're going to want to fill that tire up to. You don't want to go over the recommended tire pressure. Being under, if it's far under, that can cause you wear problems, but you never ever want to go over. That can cause you big problems. Here's some photographs showing the recommended tire pressure on these two bikes. The white wall tire, it's really easy to see that this is supposed to be inflated to 40 psi. The gum wall tire here, it's a little bit harder to see that 75 right there, but you can see there's a huge range that tires can be. So you want to make sure you look at your tire and see what the proper pressure is. It can be anything from 30 psi to 100 psi, and you want to be very careful that you have it filled to the proper recommended pressure. I also highly recommend that you buy a good quality bike pump. Using an air compressor, I've seen people explode tires. You need to be very careful when you're filling up a bicycle tire. If you're using a compressor, it's very easy to overinflate the tire. This particular bike pump I purchased probably 20 years ago, and it has been functioning great for me for 2 decades. It has its own pressure gauge built right in. It's a very, very handy thing to have when you're working on a bicycle. Now I want to go over the tools I would recommend you have if you're going to be taking on a project like this or working on any bicycle, basically. You want to have a good quality socket set that's both metric and standard. You want to make sure you have a set of box wrenches, both metric and standard. And you can see I've got an adjustable wrench right there. If you're going to use an adjustable wrench, make sure it's a high quality adjustable wrench. Make sure that the movable jaw on the adjustable wrench does not wobble. If you use it, each turn of that wrench, make sure that you have that wrench snug on your fastener. If you're going to use an adjustable wrench and you've got other box wrenches, you need to hold one side and you're turning, make sure you hold with the adjustable and turn with the fixed wrench. You'll be much happier with the results. Make sure you have an extra 10 millimeter wrench lying around. This is kind of a running joke with mechanics. You always seem to lose your 10 millimeter wrench, or someone borrows your 10 millimeter wrench. So it's always a good idea to have an extra 10 millimeter wrench on hand. Everything seems to have a 10 millimeter fastener, including Harley Davidson motorcycles. I have a friend who's a lifelong Harley mechanic, and he even has a 10 millimeter wrench in his toolbox. I believe it's for a component of the ignition that actually has a 10 millimeter fastener on it. 10 millimeter is probably the most common size fastener in the world. The most common size American fastener is 7/16. Screwdrivers. You're going to want to make sure you have flat tip and Phillips head screwdrivers. And you can see on the right, I have that 1/4 inch socket wrench. I purchased that set years ago at a local hardware store, and it's come in very handy because it has an adapter and a bunch of screwdriver bits. And it's great for getting in weird, tight little spots, and it's wonderful for removing very stubborn fasteners that have rusted in place. Standard and metric Allen wrenches. I'm sure you may have noticed on that old bike I was working on, there are no Allen screws on that bike. But pretty much every modern bicycle, you're going to encounter Allen screws. The little hex head where you fit the Allen wrench in. And it's possible that you'll have metric or standard depending on where the part is manufactured. And sometimes it'll be a combination of metric and standard. Always a good idea to have a high quality set of metric and standard Allen wrenches on hand. These particular sets here I purchased back when I was in my 20s, I believe, and they've been holding up great. You can see they have a little ball end on the long end. That's great for getting into a weird angle or getting a screw started. Very handy tools to have around. Now, this is the toolkit that I mentioned that was available through my local library. You can see it's got the tire removal tools there and a bunch of other specialty tools for working on bicycles. Now, WD-40. WD-40 is a great product for cleaning scratchy pots on old guitars. No, I'm not kidding. It actually is a great product for doing just that. If you have an old guitar and when you turn the volume and tone knobs, it makes screechy, scratchy noises. If you soak those pots with WD-40 and spin the pot back and forth, it will clean them up and stop that scratchy noise. It is not a good lubricant. I'm going to show you what I actually like to use. These are the products that I used on this particular bicycle. $4.09 for doing some basic cleaning. Gunk parts degreaser for cleaning off all of that old nasty grease. PB Blaster is a wonderful product. It's a penetrating oil. If you have any fasteners that are corroded and stuck together, PB Blaster is a fantastic product for soaking those and getting them to come apart. For lubricating chains and cables, there are many, many different manufacturers of chain and cable lube, and you should use something that is specific for chains and cables. I used Liquid Wrench chain and cable lube. This is a great product for lubricating chains and cables. There are also other specialty products that are just for bicycles, such as chain wax. That's not a product I've used very much. I have always been happy using simple chain and cable lube on my bicycles. Now, like I said before, you're probably not going to have to go through everything I went through to repair this bicycle and get it going. But what are the minimums that you should do before you ride your bike this spring? You're going to want to check for tire and brake wear. If you have hand brakes, you're going to want to check those pads and make sure they're not worn down very far, or especially that they're not worn unevenly. If they're showing a lot of wear, head to your bike shop, buy some new pads, pop them on. It's a quick fix, and it'll save you a lot of headaches in the long run. You're going to want to look for loose or missing parts. Corrosion, wheel trueness. Now that basically means that when you spin the wheel, it doesn't wobble back and forth. If it starts wobbling back and forth, that can be repaired by having the wheel trued. It's kind of complicated and can get tricky. You're probably going to want to take that wheel into your bike shop and have them true it to make sure it spins nice and straight. It is something you can do yourself. There's even a tool in that little library kit for tightening and loosening your spokes to do that kind of thing. It's not something I've had a lot of luck with doing just on a bicycle. You really need that truing stand, and it can be a headache. Also, cleanliness. You're going to want to make sure your bike is nice and clean. You need to clean and wax all painted and chrome parts. Waxing is something that a lot of people might not think about doing with their bicycles, but that wax does help protect the paint and the chrome on a bicycle. It'll make it look nicer and make it look nicer for longer. You're going to want to lubricate your chain and all of your cables, and you're going to want to check your tire pressure. Now, this bicycle, it's probably a lot more like what you have at home and what you're going to find when you go to take your bike out. This bike has reflectors on both the front and rear wheels. It's got front and rear reflectors, and it's got reflectors on the pedals. Everything looks good. Looks like you could jump on this bike and go. But wait, that frayed cable, if those frayed ends poke you in the leg, that's going to hurt. And also, this cable could come apart more and more and eventually fail. Also, believe it or not, cat hair is not a good chain lubricant. So first, I'm going to wash the bike. I just used regular car washing soap and washed and scrubbed the entire bike, including the chain, to get rid of that cat hair. And then I'm going to dry the bike off very thoroughly. Now that cable, even though it was frayed, all I had to do was twist those cables back together and put a new ferrule on the end of the cable. Very easy, simple repair. Now, I'm going to degrease and lubricate the derailleurs, the chain, and all of the cables, and check the tire pressure. Now I'm ready to go have fun. Have all the fun. Visit your local library. But get out there and have a good time. This picture right here is the repair station at my local library, the Dunlap Public Library. And in the background, you can see the Rock Island Trail right there. So I hope you can get out there and get on some of these trails and enjoy yourself. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found this presentation informative and educational, and hopefully a bit entertaining. I'd like to thank the Huntley Area Public Library for hosting me today. Now grab your helmet and your bicycle and get out there and enjoy this riding season. Thank you very much. One question I get asked a lot is, do you actually use WD-40 on old guitars? And yes, I do. As a matter of fact, this is a Gibson Melody Maker. This is 57 years old, and the pots were scratchy and making all kinds of noise, and WD-40 worked great to get this so it sounded good again. Now, I mention that not just because I think it's kind of humorous and entertaining, but knowing your products, knowing what they do well, and what they do poorly is very important. Make sure you know, for instance, WD-40, one of the reasons I really like using that is I know it won't damage a finish on an old guitar. If I get it on a table or on the floor, it's slippery, but it's easy to clean up. So know your products before you use them. Know what they're good for, what they're bad for. They're pros and cons, basically. Make sure you understand each product that you're going to use before you go and use it. The next couple questions I'd like to go over are fairly subjective with the answer. There's a lot of things that you'd have to consider to answer these questions. The first question is, how do you determine the size for a bicycle? Well, if you bought shoes or clothes for kids, you know that they grow awfully fast. So you need to make sure that there's enough adjustment that you can raise the seat, move the handlebars to make the bike rideable for the kid for more than one season, if that's your concern. If you're just going to use a bike for one season, then that's not so much of a concern. But a basic rule of thumb is the top bar of the bicycle, the bar that you need to throw your leg over, can be no more than the inseam of your pants. So if you wear a 32-inch length in Levi's, make sure that top bar is below that, so that it's, and also, for some people, that may be difficult to throw your leg over something that high. You may want something lower. A lot of newer bikes have a very slanted top bar. They're not like this old bike with where they had the very straight top bar, and then the girls' bike had the curved bar where you didn't have to raise your leg up because you don't want to be unladylike. Anyway, so it's very subjective. If you've got a bad knee and you can't throw your leg up over a bar, then you want to make sure that top bar is much lower. But the seat needs to be adjustable enough that you can get to a comfortable riding position. Now, what's a comfortable riding position? Once again, that can be very subjective. The road bikes with those curved handlebars, the guys lean way over to ride those things. If that's a comfortable riding position for you where you're leaned over the bars, that's fine. Some people, that may cause stiffness in their back and they don't want to ride that way. You may want bars that, handlebars and a seat set so that you sit more in an upright position, kind of like how you would sit in a regular straight back chair. So these are the kind of things, it's hard to have a set, hard and fast rule for what's the proper size for a bike. As a parent, you have to determine what size bike you're going to buy for your kid. And that's all about the height. And of course, kids, they don't have a stiff knee or, a bad back, so they don't need to worry about that as much. But you want to make sure that the bike is not too big for the kid. General rule, you want to make sure you can put your feet on the ground. If you feel comfortable only with your feet flat on the ground, then you need to make sure you can put your feet flat on the ground. Me personally, I just need to be able to put my toes on the ground, and that's good enough for me. But when you're buying a bike, make sure that there's enough adjustment so that you can change that. If you're looking at a bike and the seat is all the way down and you can barely touch, or it doesn't, it's like, I'm not sure this, I could probably, maybe you want to skip that bike and get something with a frame that's a little bit lower. Once it's low enough, of course, you can adjust the seat higher, and that's no problem. You also want to make sure that the handlebars can be adjusted, whether you're turning the handlebars or raising and lowering the neck, that stem expander bolt that I showed earlier in the lecture. You can raise and lower that a few inches too, but you want to make sure that it's comfortable for you. That general rule where if you're sitting on the seat, you can put your feet flat on the ground, or at bare minimum, the balls of your feet firmly on the ground. That's going to be necessary for you to ride the bike safely. I try to encourage people to, if you don't want to go out and spend a bunch of money on a new bike, look around for used bikes. You can find, basically, often you can find people just giving a bike away. But it may have some issues that need to be taken care of. But the first thing you want to look for if you're purchasing a used bike is the same things. Can I make the adjustments on this bike so that it's comfortable and safe for me or my kid or my wife or my husband to ride? So you want to make sure that it falls into what your sweet spot is, where you feel comfortable riding. If you feel comfortable riding leaned over the bars in that racing position, cool. If you need to sit up in a more upright seated position, you need to make sure that bike is adjustable to that riding position. And also, the main thing is make sure it's not too high. If the bike is too high, you're probably going to topple over getting on or off of that bike. Now, other things to look for in buying a used bike. Unfortunately, once again, no hard and fast rule, but you just want to make sure any problems that bike has, are they problems you can solve easily? If it just is completely corroded and you're just like, wow, this thing looks like garbage. Maybe it is garbage. Me personally, I've taken rusty frames that were literally buried in a barnyard and repaired those. But that's probably not what you guys are going to want to do. You want something that you can clean up, put air in the tires, maybe change a few parts and be on your way. So check those things. It's just like the things you'd check for on your bicycle before you take it out. Make sure the tires are in decent shape. If they're not in decent shape, maybe that's something you're okay with replacing. No big deal. The wear parts, if they're worn, you just need to replace them. Look for any kind of cracks. If you see cracks in the paint, there may be cracks in the welds. Anywhere the two pipes on that frame meet, look there and look for cracked paint. And if you see cracked paint, it's very possible that there's a crack in that frame. So maybe skip that one. So if you're buying a bike for a kid, honestly, make sure it's something the kid's going to think is cool so that they're like happy about riding it. And make sure that all the parts are there. Any parts that look sketchy, you can replace straight away. And make sure it fits in that size range. Now, basically, rule of thumb, that inseam measurement that you have on your jeans, make sure the top bar is below that so that you can get your leg over that bar. I've worked on a lot of antique bicycles, so I've taken, like I said, I've taken things that were pretty trashed and restored them. That's probably not what you guys are going to want to do, so use your own judgment. Be aware of what your skill level is, what your budget is for a bicycle, and try not to go over that. If somebody's giving something away, sometimes it's worth every penny of that free. So just be aware and be careful, and don't get yourself involved in something that's going to cost you more than you're really wanting to spend. Another question that's kind of associated with looking at used bicycles and looking at your own bicycle: how much dry rot, that cracking on the sidewall, is acceptable? Well, the answer to that is pretty much none. If there's any cracking on the sidewall of your tire, it's not going to get better, obviously, and it's only going to get worse. So if you see any cracks starting to develop on your tire, if it's towards the end of the season, maybe you can get away with not replacing that tire. I wouldn't recommend that. As soon as you start seeing cracks on the sidewall, you should just head to the bike shop, buy a new tire, buy a set of those tire removal tools if you're doing it yourself, and just swap out the tire. It's not that expensive, depending on the bicycle. Some bike tires are expensive. Some are less. Just depends. There's a wide variety of bicycles out there. Now, another question I get is, what are some common mistakes that a beginner makes working on a bicycle? Well, first and foremost, it's using the wrong size wrench. It's very important that when you're working on anything, any mechanical device whatsoever, that you use the proper size tool. If you are removing a Phillips head screw and you use a small screwdriver, a small Phillips head, to remove a large Phillips head screw, you're going to damage that screw, and it's going to make things more difficult. It's going to possibly strip out that screw and cause you all kinds of problems. You want to make sure that whatever tool you're using actually fits the fastener very snugly, that it's the proper size. Here's some pictures of various fasteners, a couple various fasteners that I'm showing with the wrong size wrench and the right size wrench. You can see here I've got a metric wrench on a standard size hex head bolt, and I might be able to get away with turning this fastener if it's not too tight, but it's going to round the corners of this bolt a little bit, even if it seems successful. And then when you go to work on it again, it could strip. Now, here's a picture of same fastener with the correct size wrench. And this is very important. Every old bicycle I've seen has often several fasteners where you can see somebody has taken an adjustable wrench or the wrong size wrench and tightened or loosened the fasteners, and they're rounded off. And sometimes with bicycles, they have, especially the axles have oddball sized threads, and it's hard to find nuts. You can't find them at your hardware store. You have to go to a bike shop. So make sure that your wrenches fit properly. Here's an Allen wrench. Sometimes these are a little harder to tell, but if you look at this one, this is a 1/4 inch socket. That's what this fastener needs. And I've got a metric wrench in here, and it seems to fit okay, but if you look closely, it doesn't fit quite right. And when I turn this, and I don't have a video of this is just a still photograph, but when I turn this, I can feel it wobble back and forth. Now, here's the same fastener with a correct 1/4 inch Allen head, and it fits nice and snug. Very important that you use the right size wrench. If you don't have the right size wrench, if you're going to use adjustables, especially if you're having a hard time removing a fastener, don't just run and grab a great big wrench. It can cause you all kinds of problems. I've got a few sizes of adjustable wrenches here. If you're going to use an adjustable wrench, really check and make sure that there is very little or no wobble, especially up and down on that movable jaw on that adjustable wrench. And each turn of that wrench, make sure you're paying attention and that that thumb wheel hasn't come loose and you aren't rounding off that fastener. It's very easy. It's very easy to destroy fasteners with an adjustable wrench. Another common mistake, and this is a lot on new bicycles. Mom and dad go out and buy the kid a bicycle, picking it up at a department store or ordering it online. It comes in a box. And normally, when they pack a bicycle in a box, of course, the handlebars aren't installed. It fits in a box smaller. Well, one of the things they also do is spin the front fork around backwards, and that makes the bicycle take up a little bit less room, maybe an inch or two in the box. Well, you pull the bike out, that fork is reversed, and they just pop the handlebars on there. Now, here's a kid's bike, and you can see the front fork is straight. Doesn't look like it would matter much which way you put this fork on, but look at how the handbrake grabs the wheel. That should always be on the outside of the fork, not on the inside. It's possible, there are so many different designs. It's possible it could work fine forever, but it's also possible that something could get jammed up. The cable for that brake could bind. Now also, look at this one. This little kid's bike has disc brakes, but you can see the front fork pushes outward. And it's the little welded gusset on the front of this fork where the front tire mounts. If you spin that around backwards, it moves that front tire back maybe an inch and a half. In a lot of ways, so what? But that changes the balance of the bicycle. It moves that front wheel a couple inches back, and this little kid's bike has these great big disc brakes. So the kid's trucking along, you've got that fork on there backwards. He tags that front brake, just pulls it really hard, and gets launched right over the handlebars. So it changes the balance of the bicycle. I was kind of hoping to have a video showing this, but all the bicycles that I own, it's actually impossible to put the fork on backwards. I took that old green bike and tried to put the fork on backwards, and everything stops it. There's a reflector tab that stops it from being put on backwards. The fender stops it from being put on backwards. But you can see the curve of the fork as I've got it almost turned around backwards here in this photo. That's what I'm talking about. A lot of front forks have, now this one is an extreme curve. You couldn't possibly mistake that this is supposed to face inward. But a lot of forks have a little bit of push that moves that front wheel out a little bit. And remember, anytime the fork curves or it's got gussets and it moves the wheel away from the fork, that's supposed to be forward. Anytime there's a brake mounted on the front fork, that's supposed to be on the outside of the fork. Little bit of a common mistake. If you go to pull that bike out of a box, brand new, look at that front fork, look at the pictures of the bike, and make sure that you have it looking exactly like the photograph. And look at the photograph. Sometimes the drawings they put in the assembly instructions are terrible. Very often the wording in assembly instructions is just, it's literal translation, so it's gobbledygook and makes no sense. So just be careful and check that front fork and make sure it's put on the right way. Another question. How old should a kid be before they start working on bikes? I often get such subjective questions. This is one, it depends on the kid. Is the kid really mechanically inclined? Who knows? Here's a picture of me at 11 years old, pulling a wheelie on my BMX bike. My brother and I had just replaced the front fork on this bicycle, and I purchased a bunch of pads, actually safety pads. You can see I've got no helmet, but I'm worried about those safety pads. So I was 11. My brother would have been 14, 15. And we were, well, first of all, we had destroyed the front fork on this bicycle, jumping it and doing silly things like that, and purchased a new fork and installed it. And I had been working on my own bicycles for probably a couple years at this point. But it all depends on the kid. I can tell you when I first started working on bikes, I used vice grips or whatever I could. And that's something you never want to do. Here's a picture of vice grips on a bolt. Don't use vice grips on anything. If you've got a stripped fastener that you're going to remove and throw out, then it's okay to use vice grips. But don't use vice grips on anything you plan to save. They're kind of an emergency last-ditch effort tool. But one thing, any kid doing anything, especially for the first time, they need adult supervision. And you need to make sure that the adult knows what they're doing and is instructing the kid properly. And maybe the kid helps instead of doing it on their own. But this is such a subjective thing. Some kids are going to get mechanical things straight away. Some kids it just isn't going to make sense to them, and they're going to get frustrated and want to give up. So adult supervision, and see if the kid's enjoying it, if they're getting the concepts of tightening fasteners properly, using the proper size wrench, etc. And any age where they show the interest and have the ability. So that could be anything, from a very small child up to maybe the kid just never wants to work on a bicycle. So I'm now asked, what projects are you working on now? Well, this is actually a project that I started a long time ago. Here's me when I was 18 years old, and I had built a custom-made tandem bicycle. I had actually taken a couple of old Schwinn frames that I found on a farm and cut them and welded them together to make this tandem bike, and rode this bike for many, many years. And it got kind of put off to the side and neglected, and now it needs to be rebuilt. And so this is one that I'm hoping to get done this season. I want to rebuild this bike. I'm going to change a few things, modernize a few things on it, and hopefully I will get this down from the garage ceiling and rebuilt and up and running, hopefully early summer. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, and if you have any questions that I haven't answered, please visit your library. If you're like me, I'm the kind of person who, since I was a kid, if I had a question that I couldn't answer, we didn't have the internet when I was a kid. I loved the reference desk at the library, walking up and asking any question, sometimes really odd questions that you wouldn't think of asking a reference librarian. They can get you the answers. They can get you the materials you need to learn just about anything. So go to your local library, ask questions, ask for the materials you need to learn how to do anything you want to learn how to do. Your library is an amazing resource, and you can learn literally anything you want to learn by visiting your local library. Thank you again, and have a safe and enjoyable riding season. Bye-bye.